I reflected on all the times I had handed out a yes. The list was staggering, and I knew deep down that the pace I had been running and this load I had been carrying were not sustainable. This is a quote from Daring to Fight by Victoria Menninger. You may hear birds in the background, my husband on the tractor, or the children playing with the dogs. This is real life on the prairie with Donita Fogelman of prairie-trail.com, weathering the dust storms of life with God's divine help. And today I actually have author Victoria. Am I saying your last name right?
It's close, but it's okay. It's Menninger, but I've heard
Menninger.
it all sorts of ways.
Okay, I get it. I get it. My name gets pronounced a lot of different ways too. As long as they call me for dinner, I'm happy.
Exactly.
So
That's what my mother always says.
I daring to fight when grit, grace, and faith take depression head on. And I love this cover with the boxing gloves. It's simple and to the point there. Uh, I've been avoiding your book. I've had it for about a month now, and I've been avoiding it because once you've gone through the depths, you want to ignore you wherever there, or at least that's kind of how I feel.
I understand that.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, I really don't want to. I'm sure it's a really great book, and it's been just kind of sitting in the corner, like whispering to me, "You really need to read me. You really need to read." But then I picked it up, and I'm a very slow reader, and I went through this, and some of it I skimmed, I'll admit, but I went through this in 2 days. So for me, that's huge. And I'm amazed at the practicality plus biblical insight that you have in this book. And I just kind of like to start with I talk about sustainability a lot, and people don't realize that sustainability doesn't start with uh solar panels. Yeah, or electric cars or whatever. It starts there with what is sustainable for you to do physically and emotionally and spiritually. So talk to me about where were you at that point?
Yeah, so really, I mean, I'm the one who does all things, right? So actually, at the point that I landed up really going through that dark season of depression, we were living on 15 acres. We were homesteading as well, so I'm not new to that whole thing. I grew up on a dairy farm. All of that, I think we've had a little bit of conversation about that in northern New Mexico, of all places. But at the time, prior, when the story of this book takes place, is really we were at the end of pastoral ministry. Had been in pastoral ministry for 6 years, and I just, as somebody who just loves to help, I had just taken on way too much for a long period of time, raising 4 children, homeschooling, doing all the things. And it just became too much. And there's a lot of things that contributed to my depression. It wasn't just the weight of stuff I was doing, but it all kind of compounded together. And I think you're right. It's really, if we want to be healthy and sustainable, we have to start with us internally first. And knowing what it is that God has put on our plate or not put on our plate, and handing out appropriate yeses and appropriate no's, probably more no's than yeses. But I had to learn that the hard way, and found myself crashing about 8 years ago to a really, really dark place. So that's kind of where the book picks up, is kind of in that dark place and then coming out of that. And honestly, I'm a practical kind of person. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of clinical stuff. Read a lot of biblical stuff, all of it good. I have a degree in psychology. So I had all the information, but I was like, okay, now how do I actually do this? Like, what does that look like? And so that's where how I wrote the book, was I just needed some practical steps to move through that season.
Wonderful. I noticed not too far in the book you talk about owning your story, and the people who had wounded you
Mhm.
intentionally or unintentionally, and how you're not excusing those those people and those wounds.
Mhm.
um that because that's something that people don't talk about much. You're either pointing a finger or you're forgiving to the point that you're not. I know what I did was I forgave people to the point that I was ignoring the wounds.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
just because you forgive somebody doesn't mean that the wound is not there.
Right. It's the wound is valid, whether it was intentional, unintentional. And as humans, look, we're going to wound each other. When we're in relationship with one another, we're going to have disagreements or wounding and may cause rifts or whatever. It's very real. And so you're right. We either forgive to the point that we then gloss over the wound and never deal with the wound, but it still festers, it's still there. And so, I found to walk through that in a healthy way was owning the fact that, yeah, I had been wounded, and I took that to a safe place, which was my counselor, and worked through that. Worked through that forgiveness, worked through that wounding. But in the book, when I talk about owning my own story, there were pieces of that I had to own, where maybe I had done some wounding or hadn't, maybe done what I needed to do in that relationship, or even in the carrying of the load on my shoulders. I have the ability to say yes or no. And so that was on me. So when I talk about owning my story, it's what pieces of it can I own that are mine, that I need to work through, that I need to take responsibility for. It's not that other people who are part of my story, they matter, right? But honestly, their story is not mine to tell. So you're not going to find in the book those stories of that wounding, of that hurt, of that whatever. Because honestly, for me, it's important in my story, but it wasn't important to the book. It wasn't important about those things. And again, not my story to tell for them. I had to own my piece, and that's kind of what I encourage people to do. What are the parts that you can do something about in your own story? And that's what we want to go forward for, because that's where actually we find the most freedom. I think is when we begin to own that, and can work through it in a safe space. And that's what I would reiterate. It's a safe space. We don't want to go and talk to that person who is going to share it all the way up and down the lane or whatever. We
Yeah.
all have people like that in our life. But are there people in your life that can hold space for you and be safe and not and really have your best interest at heart?
Yeah, yeah. I think we tend to go like one way or another. We
Mm-hmm.
either go introspective so much that it's like everything's my fault and I have to fix everything in order to heal.
Right.
Or it's everybody else's fault and I have to fix everybody else in order to
Mm-hmm.
heal. And sometimes you have to let go of some relationships, and you do talk about that in the book. And then sometimes you need to fight for some relationships, and you kind of also touch on that a little bit in the book. I love the way you have that balance in
Mm-hmm.
there. It's a hard
It
balance.
is. It is, and we're not going to figure it out all at once. Like this journey for me, while the worst of it was about a year, I mean, I'm about 8, 9 years out now. I still am working through things because our wounding can sometimes be kind of like an onion. It's in layers, and you have to peel layer by layer back. And we can't go straight for the core. I mean, we want to, but we don't always know what it is. So when we work at it in layers and give ourselves grace, because I think I talk about this in the book. Again, it's been 2 years since I wrote it. So there's illustrations I use now that I'm like, did I put that in the book? But anyway, it's like a wound. When we have a cut that gets infected, say, and we have to go back to the doctor and they have to clean it out, and the cleaning out of that is painful. And even the healing from that is painful. But if it's done properly and cared for properly, over time it scabs over so that when you touch that scar, which may always remain, you may always see it, it doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't cause you to weep and be in pain. And so I think it's knowing that it's okay for it to be uncomfortable and to be willing to lean into the uncomfort, the discomfort of that process.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And you also go into what depression is, which was huge for me
Mm-hmm.
because although I probably had a little bit, I mean, we all have some,
Sure,
growing
sure.
up and different things. Uh, but I remember going to the doctor a year after our fifth was born, and
Mm-hmm.
we had whooping cough which was huge. All 5 children and myself.
Mm.
It was
Yeah.
a big thing. And then we almost lost him to RSV.
Wow.
And it was just a big, I had been on bed rest with him for several months, and it had just been a big year.
Yeah.
And I went to the doctor a year after the whooping cough diagnosis. And I said, there is something wrong with me. My
Mm.
thyroid's out of whack, something, I can't function. I'm sitting in front of the computer and I am avoiding life.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And he's like, okay, well, we can check your thyroid and stuff. But and I love this doctor. We're friend of the family, and we can argue about my health care and being a midwife and an herbalist and stuff. Sometimes we have to toss things back and forth a little bit. So he said,
Mm-hmm.
but I think what the trouble is, I think you're depressed. And I
Mm.
said, oh no, I can't be depressed. I've got a wonderful husband and 5 beautiful children. And he said, Donita, it's not just a sad feeling.
Yeah.
Depression's different. He had to explain it to me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the way you talk about working with your doctor with
Mm-hmm.
a plan of not just, hey, let's take this pill and do this. Let's have a
Mm-hmm.
plan to begin with. So I'm like, okay, I'll try it for a month, was my
Right.
thing. And I tried it for a month, made a huge difference. I'm like, I
Mm-hmm.
didn't even know I was depressed.
Yeah.
Huge difference. By the end of the month, I'm up doing things and stuff. And we decided to change to a natural alternative
Mm-hmm.
for me,
Yeah.
which I was able to get off of for a while. And then we had number 6, and then I needed to get back on. And so, sometimes your body just wavers in there. And but it was huge. And I like the way that I've read a lot of books,
Mm-hmm.
and I took psychology. That was my minor. I
Sure.
decided to have a family, but I love psychology, and I've,
Mm-hmm.
studied a lot. But we even Christian sources tend to talk about just one aspect, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe 2 aspects, the spiritual side or the
Right.
emotional side, but don't really go into all the different aspects that can be happening. And I
Mm-hmm.
love the way you talked about the physical in the book as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what we have to remember is that God has uniquely created each and every one of us, and the way our bodies function are unique to us. There are many things that can help and can work, but what works for one may not work for the other. And so, what I was just finding in mine, so yeah, I went to visit my doctor early on, pretty early on, after I realized what I was dealing with. It took me 2 years, believe it or not, to figure out, oh, that's what this is. And to get to a very severe place of it for myself. But I had known my doctor for many, many years. He had seen me since high school. And so he knew when I walked into his office, I was not my normal self. And so, but I had told him I want a plan just because I knew I wanted to approach it holistically, right? It wasn't just one thing or the other. And the thing about depression is it's complex. We can't just say, oh, it's just this or it's just that, because again, it affects everybody differently. But I would say, if you look at what the markers for depression are, the symptoms for depression, and you begin to notice a few of those maybe in yourself, have that conversation with your doctor, with your counselor. Those are important folks to have in your court, because they're trained to kind of look for those things, and they can be advocates for you. For me, it was also then, what are some of the other things that I could be doing? Because it wasn't just one thing. And for myself, I ended up was on medicine for a year, and then was able to come off of that and do some other things that were helpful to me. But I have friends that they continue on that because that's what's right for them. And so allowing ourselves grace for one, and to know that there's not something just wrong with us, just because my plan doesn't look like their plan and so forth. But that there is hope out of that place. A lot of times when depression hits, like you said, you just started feeling like you needed to not run away from the world, but you were disconnected. And oftentimes when we're in that place of depression, yeah, the things that used to interest us don't interest us anymore, or we find ourselves drawing away from people, and that's different than seeking solitude. So solitude is good for us. Solitude is good for our souls. But when we pull away to the point of not being in connection with people, then we just need to go, is this a red flag or not? And just looking for those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. There's so many things that can help. And sometimes, a medication or something like that can just help you get onto your feet enough that you can think through what other options you need to be looking at, you know. There's just so many things that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And working with your doctor on that and what works for you. And maybe it is homeopathic remedies after that. I think those are valid as well. I worked with some of those myself and things. And so, knowing that this is you may have to try a few different things that work again for you and for your body, because
Right.
you're uniquely created, and that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah, definitely. And our bodies change with years.
They
So
do.
as
With
something
having babies and all the things
Yes,
our bodies go
something
through.
that worked while I was still having babies compared to
Yeah,
after hysterectomy is a little different thing.
it
You got to
is.
juggle things around a little bit. Definitely.
Indeed.
You also discuss in the book the feeling of deep abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that intensely. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it probably hit me a little bit. I don't want to say more so, but differently because of the CPTSD from childhood trauma. And
Right. Yeah.
there was some abandonment issues from
Mm-hmm.
when I was a baby,
Right.
So I had a little bit more, complexity in there,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the fact that you brought that up as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, abandonment is one of those things that is a deep soul wound, and can result from a lot of different things. For me, it was some trauma, some things that I went through personally as well. But as humans, we have a deep need for belonging and for love. We receive that from God, from people in our lives, from families, whatever. And when we have wounding that feels like abandonment, one, the feeling is valid, right? So we want to be able to explore that and the truth of that. But this is where working with a counselor in that area is going to be so helpful. Like I worked with my counselor, Lynn, in some of these areas, and it took a while to get through some of those, even years. I mean, even last year I was working through something. I thought I like, oh, we're good now, like all this stuff. I wrote a
I
book.
understand. Yes.
We're good. But
Yes.
the real reality is that there was something that triggered for me, and I had to go back to her and talk that through, and found that again, deep wound of abandonment. And so oftentimes we want to just shove our emotions or shove these things down and say, oh, well, that's not valid because so and so said. No, when we're feeling those emotions are valid. It's a matter of finding truth behind the emotion. Is it a lie or a truth we're believing? But it's always valid.
Yes. Yes. And I think we need that. The
Mm-hmm.
whole mental health movement that's happening right now, I think that's one of the good things that is being
Mm-hmm.
brought through that is giving it a validity and
Mm-hmm.
helping to remove some of the bad connotations
Right.
we've
The
had over.
stigma, the shame, all those things.
Yes.
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
absolutely. I love that the conversation is, I hate that there are things that have happened in our world that have caused some of this, like with the pandemic and everything. We're seeing those statistics go through the roof, as far as depression and anxiety, and it's understandable. And so while I'm not, excited about the fact that those things happened, I am glad for the conversation that is spurring out of some of those places and things for that conversation to continue and be in healthy spaces for people to find help.
Yes, yes. And sometimes I think once we've been in the darkness
Mm-hmm.
and once you realize what it is, like for me to just even know what it is,
Right.
I know when my mother passed away, we
Mm-hmm.
weren't really close. I didn't meet her until I was 8 years old,
Mm-hmm.
but she lived up here close to us for the last 5 years of her life. When she
Yeah.
passed away, I had absolutely no idea what to expect
Mm.
because, we didn't have the mommy daughter,
Right.
relationship.
That
I
bond.
had no idea what to expect.
Mm-hmm.
And having dealing with the rest of the family became, I tried to do it all myself. Okay.
Right. Right.
And
We do.
yes, and when the family would step in to help and to do their part, there's always that conflict, especially with people you're not really close to. And
Hmm.
I internalized, I tried to, you know, be non-confrontational, which I'm not
Hmm.
generally a non-confrontational person. I'm
Hmm.
generally a communicator. And I finally called a counselor friend that I knew and trusted and said,
Yeah.
"Hey, I don't know what I'm doing. This is completely different territory for me. I feel like
Hmm.
will you meet with me?" She's a distance away, over the phone for a
Yeah.
year, and just
Hmm.
help me work through whatever this grief is going to be for me
Right.
in this
Right.
situation. And I'm so glad I took that
Hmm.
step.
Hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't know at the time if I was going through depression, or, I didn't know what was going on
Right.
with
Right.
me at that point. And we had hormones and everything else happening all at the
Sure.
same time, so there was so much going on. But when you recognize, being able to
Mm.
just, okay, something's off, I need
Yeah.
help, call that professional. Sometimes
Yeah.
your friends don't understand, sometimes your family doesn't understand. Go ahead and call that professional. I had at one point that we had a lot of stress, and I called, it was another
Hmm.
doctor I was using at the time, and I said, "Okay, here's what's going on." She said, "Come in today. We will take care of you."
Yeah.
They do take it very seriously.
They do.
And, it may not be what you want to do. It may not be what you want to hear at the time, but
Yeah.
don't be afraid to take that step.
Right.
I loved your analogy in the book of the $20 bill. Would you
Mm.
mind sharing that?
Sure. So, yeah, so this was one, and again, I've heard it a number of different places, so it's not unique to me. I didn't come up with it, and all, but really, it's this idea. So if you have a crisp $20 bill and you hand it to somebody and say, "How much is this worth?" Right? It's worth $20. And then you take it and you crumple it up, right? And you throw it on the ground and you stomp all over it. And then you hand it to somebody. How much is it still worth? Still worth $20. Doesn't matter how much mud or dirt or what gets stomped on it, or how crumpled or rumpled or ripped it is, the worth of that $20 is still $20. It doesn't get devalued simply for what it experienced, getting stomped all over, whatever. And really, the analogy really is, it's the same thing in our lives. A lot of times when we go through trauma or difficulties, or we just feel broken and maybe not loved because we feel so broken, we tend to devalue who we are. But our value in the eyes of the Lord, first of all, but our value as a human being has not changed. We are still just as valuable as before that trauma or that event or whatever happened in our lives. And so really, it's this understanding, and that's really hard to get our heads wrapped around it, because when we go through a difficult time, when we go through a dark time, we feel broken. We
Yes.
feel like, well, maybe we're not lovable, maybe nobody can accept me or love me for who I am. But one, the Lord always receives us for who we are and who He's created us to be, but we don't lose our value. And which is hard to receive, but it's still the truth, I believe.
It definitely, it's a truth I think everyone needs to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in this day and age, everybody is dealing, there's just so much. There's
Yeah,
just so much right now. And no
there.
matter where you are politically or anywhere else, uh, I think everybody feels broken in some way. And from the youngest children
You
to
do.
our elders of society, everybody has feels like they've been through
Right.
it.
Yeah, they do. And I would even say this back a little bit. You were talking about how when you picked up the book, a little bit afraid of what might get uncovered. But even there was that season where you weren't sure, you didn't know you were dealing with depression. I have had people read my book from the perspective they wanted to understand depression better. They wanted to understand how to help that friend. And they end up going, "Oh, wait a minute, I might be experiencing a little bit of this." Because maybe what they're going through at the moment is maybe they had a happy occasion happen in life, uh, a, child got married, or maybe their child, like for us, we just landed up, our last just left for college. I guess she's going into her second year, but it just feels like yesterday, right? So we're an empty nest. It's a joyful event as far as for my children are concerned. Like they're thriving, they're doing well. But as a mom, I'm like, okay, after 23 years of raising children, all of a sudden it's just me, myself, and my husband. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just
Yes,
two of us.
yes.
And while we should say, oh, that's a happy occasion. Or last year, two of my daughters got married. We're still recovering. But
We
yes,
had two of them got married the same year within the same season. Oh my
yes,
goodness, I
yes. What
survived.
are they thinking? No kidding. But it was a joyful occasion. But there was a
Yes,
part of me that was grieving because of the change in my life. And that grief is valid, and we have to we want to process that healthy. And so I would say every time they leave for college, I grieve again, and it gets easier and easier. But I have to look at those triggers in me and know, okay, I just need to work through some of this. But people
yes.
sometimes go through joyful events and they feel like they should be happy and okay and all
Oh,
should be
and you
well.
grade yourself for feeling
Yes,
bad, right?
yeah. Grief is around not just death. Grief is around even those anytime a season of life changes or we have a loss, good or bad, we go through those things sometimes. And so
Yes,
just
and you
being able to
should.
understand that is a
Yeah.
good thing.
And it is a good book to read if you do have a friend who's struggling. And I love
Yeah.
how you say, do not step back and give them space. Lean
Yeah.
in, lean
Right.
in and be there. You don't have to
Right.
say anything, you don't have to fix anything. It's okay
Mhm.
if you don't know what to do, just be there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Send a
Presence is
card,
is
call,
really
stop
powerful.
by. Yes, huge.
Right.
Okay, where can people find you?
Yeah. So easiest place to find me is online, victoriavinegar.com. So it's my website. I do a lot of writing there. And you can find more information about the book, but you can also find me on Instagram under the same name, and Facebook under the same name. So Victoria Vinegar is where you can find me.
Okay, and I will definitely share those links. And if you have any questions or anything, definitely leave them in the comments. We thank you so much for joining us. And
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
oh yeah, this has been I think something a very needed conversation that we need to have a lot of.
Mm, I
Uh,
agree. I agree. So thank you for helping to move that conversation forward. It's important.
yes, definitely. Now, let's see if I can figure out where I'm at. And this is Donita from prairie-trail.com, guiding wearied hearts through the storms of life on an adventurous journey in sustainable living with prairie simplicity and pioneer resilience. And remember, you can make it through the dust storms of life with God's divine help.